Today's Tawney lecturer is Dr. Deborah Oxley of Oxford University. Deborah has worked on many and diverse areas of economic and social history. Her first book shone light on a much neglected group, women transported to Australia. Convict Maids, published in 1996, remains essential reading for anyone interested in gender and crime, as well as the history of Australia. Deborah has continued to make contributions to the history of Australia, but in recent years, she's turned her attention increasingly to anthropometrics, an exciting and dynamically developing area of social and economic history. With Steve Nicholas, she pioneered a focus on gender within anthropometric history. And she also took on two of our tribe's biggest hitters in a debate about the interaction between disease and height, and in my opinion, did not come off worst. Most recently, with Sarah Horrell and David Meredith, she found some of the first material on weight and integrated that with height in the study of BMI in history. And the paper measuring misery, in my view, will remain a classic in anthropometric discourse. Today she's going to talk to us on weighty matters, anthropometrics, gender and health inequality in history.
Well, the last time an Aussie talked to you at this august gathering, he talked to you about sheep. So it's right and proper that I should talk to you about convicts. Not the crimes they committed, but how tall they grew. Well, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, when I was a little girl, my dad told me about these charts that the doctor had that could predict how high I would grow. I thought this was intriguing, and they would have looked something like this. So along the bottom we have age, and along the vertical axis we have height. So from 2 up to adulthood, and you can see these strong patterns. That's the middle person, the 50th centile, girl and boy. Strong patterns of height by age, but we don't grow evenly. And that dotted line shows weight change on an annual basis, height change on an annual basis, velocity of height. You can see tremendously high velocity when you're 1-2 years old, and you can see another period of accelerated growth in adolescence. So that's the adolescent growth spurt. Girls enter that growth spurt around 11, peaks at 12.5, and it slows down with puberty. Boys are a year and a half after that. And as anthropometric historians, we're particularly interested in terminal heights, the level that are reached, and the age at which they're reached. And we're interested in the timing and peakedness of the adolescent growth spurt. So this pattern of height by age, we can predict from it because we get onto a particular trajectory and we stick to it. It's called target-seeking growth or canalization. So if you start off on the 50th centile, there's a good chance you'll end up on the 50th centile. And if you do, we tend to think of you reaching your full potential. But you can get knocked off course. So you might start off on the 50th centile, but end up further down, only at the 10th centile. And that we think of as stunted. If you were meant to be, if your maximum genetic potential was 6'3" and you end up at 6 foot, you are actually stunted. But you're going to find a bigger proportion of stunted people at the lower end of the distribution. So height is a measure of net nutrition. It's a balancing act. It's cumulative over the growing years, and it's net. So it's a combination of parental genes, what you inherit from your mum and dad, but also nutrition. And work by Horrell and partners has recently emphasised the importance of quality as well as quantity of nutrition. Now, in theory, your genes and plus your nutrition leads to growth, but it's a little more complicated than that. And this is part of the appeal of anthropometrics, is that there's a balancing act goes on. This is the net nutrition. So we use calories for lots of things. We use calories when we're working. We use calories when we're playing. Enjoying yourself doesn't stop the use of calories. We use calories to keep at an even temperature, thermoneutrality. So if we're cold, we shiver. We shiver deep inside in our organs. And if we get really, really cold, we shiver on the outside as well as the inside. That burns up calories. If we're too hot, we sweat. So keeping an even temperature takes calories. Fighting the disease environment can consume calories. So if you have a fever, you're burning up calories. If your core temperature is raised just 1 degree, your rate at which you burn up calories increases by 12%. Or if you have an illness that disrupts your ability to absorb nutrients, so if you have prolonged bouts of diarrhea or vomiting. So the disease environment swallows up calories and impacts on our growth. Even less tangible things like happiness and stress involve, our body reacts to that. If we're stressed, we often are twitchy and we use up energy that way, and our body ceases to function quite as fully as it should. So there's this box of items that we think of as living standards contributing to this story. And it's what's left over, the nutrition that comes in, what gets used up, what is left over goes in to growth. That's how tall we grow. And there are really 3 outcomes that can occur from this process. You can reach your full potential. You can be well nourished, you can be healthy, you can live in good housing, you can be well clothed so that you're not having to generate your own heat. And when that happens over the growing years, you're likely to have a timely growth spurt, to reach maturity early, and to reach your maximum potential height. For girls, it means that they'll reach menarche at an earlier point, so that they've reached their sexual maturity earlier. They're going to start having regular ovulatory cycles at an earlier point. Later in life, postpartum, after birth, their fertility will return more rapidly. They'll also have a later menopause. So there are lots of factors get built in during these growing years. So if your pattern's disrupted, if you mainly have good conditions, but there are patterns in your life that lead to a bout of ill health, or nutrition dries up for some reason, or if you're working too hard, if you're using your calories in other ways, that knocks you off course. But the body is clever. It has this target-seeking nature, this desire to catch up back to its trajectory. So the growth curve with an insult to your nutritional status would look like this. It could drop very dramatically, your velocity of growth. But if things improve, your velocity can accelerate. You can get supernormal height velocity, up to 4 times the rate of growth for your chronological age. So a lot depends, though, on the timing of this. At this particular sort of scenario, you've got disrupted growth, but you're going to end up at the height you should have achieved if there's chance for catch-up. If the insult happens a bit later on, it could disrupt the puberty stage, and the body will delay puberty as long as it can to allow you to catch up. And you can grow for longer if you need to catch up, but you have to have good conditions to allow this process. So that's the second variation in outcomes. With that, the growth spurt is varied outcomes, varied ages at maturity. You may or may not end up at full height. The third outcome, though, is stunted. It's when you're persistent deprivation that's uncompensated. So again, it can be lack of diet, disease, overwork. We also know other factors that are very influential. Large family size. If there's a lot of kids competing for resources, that reduces what everybody gets. Birth order. If you've got lots of brothers and sisters coming home, bringing illness into the household, we find that that's a strong predictor of diminished height. In that scenario, velocity of growth can really be pushed out. So it's delayed, puberty is delayed, you grow for longer, and you're never going to achieve the full height. So that's the stunted scenario. Now, we think that we can minimise the genetic component of individual stories and capture environmental factors by massing together lots of people. This is why we use very large data sets. So let's have a little natural experiment at this point. Let's take a group of Brits. So they're born here, and it's the early 19th century that they're growing up in. And we'll look at their growth profile. But we'll take those Brits and we'll transplant them to a very different environment. We're going to take them to Australia, to a lovely 18th century style economy with a warm climate, where there is an abundant food supply. The staple grain is wheat, but the staple food is meat. This is something unheard of over here. But there are complaints if you don't get meat 3 times a day. These are sometimes referred to as people of plenty, like the Americans. And there's evidence that the indigenous men had an average height approaching 6 foot. So this is a place of considerable nutritional advantage. Let the Brits marry together and have kids, and let's have a look at what happens to the sons and the grandsons of these families. So we're going to look at 15,000 UK convicts sent to Tasmania and 13,000 of their sons and grandsons who do end up in trouble with the police and get their heights measured. So on this chart, we've got age along the bottom, height on the vertical, and the image in the background is our modern growth profile. That's the growth profile for the UK born, for the convict men and boys. So you can see that they are well below even the third centile of the modern population. They're way down in the stakes, they're short. You'll see that they manage to get to the 11th percentile because growth is prolonged. They grow into their 20s, they're in their mid-20s before they reach terminal height. Their sons and grandsons do somewhat better. They manage to end up at the 21st percentile. So they've created this gap. The sons and the grandsons are about 1¼ inches taller in adulthood. That's within just 1 and 2 generations. We're seeing that change. The gap for the growing years is considerably bigger, 3¼ inches. And we can get at this pattern during childhood more efficiently by measuring the distance of these lines from the average person, the 50th centile, which we do using Z-scores, which is standard deviations away from the mean, which is what we do in this chart. So that's the average person, that's the 50th centile. Down there, you're into the 5th centile, the 1st centile of the modern population. The UK-born convicts are way down by modern standards, and you can see that a great gap emerges compared to the modern growth profile. It particularly emerges as the modern population enters into the growth spurt, heading towards puberty at the end of that. So it dips rapidly, and then when the UK 19th century kids start entering their growth spurt before puberty, they start to improve. The Aussie-born are operating at a higher level, they're closer to the modern average, and you can see that they pull out of the disadvantage earlier. So better nutrition, they're entering their adolescent growth spurt a little bit earlier. So it's nice that we can use height to get a feeling of these processes and a ranking. And a familiar one for the UK in the 19th century is that the Scots were the tallest, followed by the Irish, followed by the English, and sadly followed by the Welsh. And there's a good 2 inches, but we see this same pattern repeated again and again in different 19th century data sets. And this ability to rank and get at distributional inequalities is one of the most appealing aspects of anthropometrics. This is a famous clip that you probably all know, but I'll treat you to it again anyway. It's the class clip, and it's written by Marty Feldman, and it's considered to be a great classic because it equates height with class and does so to very good effect.
I look down on him because I am upper class. I look up to him because he is upper class. But I look down on him because he is lower class. I am middle class. I know my place. I look up to them both. But I don't look up to him as much as I look up to him. Because he has got innate breeding.
Well, that's a relationship that was well known in the 19th century. So let's put some historical characters onto this, into this relationship. We'll have Joseph Banks representing the Fellows of the Royal Society. He comes in at that level. We have Alexander Gibson representing the military, and Charles Cook representing a London criminal. Now, to be fair, at 6'5", John Cleese is way over average, and at 5'1", Ronnie Corbett is way under. So let's move them out of the picture and look at a more reasonable scale. So the Fellows of the Royal Society managed to average a stature of 70 inches. By comparison, Hertfordshire labourers, who we know about, and criminals managed about 65.5 inches. The military came in between. And as you can see from Alexander Gibson, some of these categories clearly overlap. But a gap of 4.5 inches is a big gap in adult stature. And it's even more amplified when you look at children. And so 14-year-olds going to the Sandhurst Academy at the end of the 18th century were 8.25 inches taller than 14-year-old boys registering at the Marine Society in London. And this is a context in which we see scientific theories develop that explain, for example, criminality, and see criminals as not quite a separate race, but they see them as atavistic, as a throwback to an earlier stage in human evolution in the later 19th century. 19th century. So you could see in this society big differences in class. So what's the point of it all? Does it matter that we can find that historical populations conform to predictable patterns of human growth? Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to argue that yes, it does matter. We've seen that environments do affect this relationship with stature, but it also means that we can use stature to reflect on those historical environments. So it's a different way into looking at the historical problem, at what was happening. It captures groups that are often marginalised in the records, so we get to see about different people. It measures deprivation as well as gain, and both of these are important for health, for well-being, for productivity, for a range of factors. It allows big questions to be answered. So we've seen early work done on child poverty. Major book, the first for Britain, was the book by Floodwatcher and Gregory, Height, Health and History, that gives us this long-run view of what was happening to nutritional status for the very first time. That's then followed up by Fogel's Escape from Hunger and Premature Death, a book that makes the claim that 20 to 30% of economic growth since the late 18th century is attributable to the improving thermodynamic efficiency of humans, i.e. we grew bigger and were better able to transfer food into energy and produce output. And themes in that book were then followed up most recently with The Body, a contribution that tells us not only about energy cost accounting, which we're going to have a little look at, a long-term series on nutrition, but about the way the human body responds to its environment and indeed shapes our economic fortunes. So we're going to, in the next few slides, take information from these two great works and tell a little story with them. So this is going to be a Bernard Harris series with a bit of a Muldrew tweak at the start. So what we've got along the horizontal axis is 2 centuries, and on the vertical axis we've got calories, kilocalories, it's the same thing, per day, per consuming unit. That's slightly different from per capita, but it allows for the fact that a child consumes far less than an adult. So a 4-year-old child is worth 0.4 of a man. So a man is 1 consuming unit. So this is getting at the available calories for the people. And this is the story we get. The dark line, the thicker line, is net of trade. The thin line is domestic production. And you can see what starts out as a very positive story. We have 3/4 of a century of improvement in nutritional availability. Average calories are on this upswing. That means that we can grow taller and bigger and work harder, and we can work for longer. There are controversial arguments that perhaps it makes us brighter, that there is a link with cognition and the ability of children to learn. It also makes us more fertile. And I think it's interesting to consider 2 generations of good health. So a baby born there who has their own baby then, so that's 2 generations, they will have a baby, that child will have a baby 25 years after that. And at that point, it's interesting to think what it's going to do to the crude fertility rate, the crude birth rate, and you're going to see it soar. And it's that massive increase in the population that we see from the very late 18th century and at the start of the 19th century that means that English farmers lose the race. They're doing a good job of increasing output, but they can't match the rate at which we're increasing the mouths to feed. And we only have points in this story, but from around 1770, average nutritional availability starts to fall. And it falls, and it falls, and it falls. And if it wasn't for trade, we would be hitting famine levels. 1846, we get rid of the Corn Laws, but we are warned by Michael Turner that it's wrong to think that the approaches to British estuaries and ports were heaving with merchant vessels, creaking with surplus foreign produce. It's going to take another 30 years before the foreign produce comes to save Britain. We have to wait for the Americans to build the railways to get the wheat to the ports. We need Russia to get rid of serfdom and reorganise its agriculture. We need Australian wheat. We need New Zealand dairy, Argentinian beef. Those things are going to come to the rescue, but they're not going to make it until later in the 19th century and into the 20th century. So what does this do to prices? Well, that's Bob Allen's London CPI. The big jump, of course, is the Napoleonic War, which throws great disruption into the mix. But we enter a whole new plateau for prices of food at this point. Well, let's look at Floodwatcher and Gregory's wonderful series on military heights and see what was happening to stature, because this is energy cost accounting. I should explain that's where you take all the available land that's being used for farming, you look at the output, and you estimate what the global nutrition availability is and divide by the number of mouths to feed, or in this case, a per consuming unit figure. So it's one measure of nutritional status. How does height stack up as the other measure of nutritional status? So we use Floodwatcher and Gregory's military series. We did a regression with age dummies, time dummies. We just picked out the English and the Welsh because the energy accounting series only refers to England and Wales. And in the original data set, the Army and the Marines who were in it are in a 50-50 ratio, whereas a 90 to 10% ratio is more realistic. So we weighted it according to how many Army and Marines there were per year of recruitment. We also controlled for the size of the establishment when these people are recruited. If the Army is little, it can be quite selective about who it picks. When it needs a lot of people, it lowers its height standards. So we're smoothing a bit this way, but we're not adjusting for truncation for the height selection of the military. So what happens? Well, we see in an era when nutrition was improving, we see military stature was improving. And when we saw nutrition fall, we very rapidly see heights fall. This is by year of birth, so they are coincidental, and it's those first few years that are so important in the growth story. It is messy here. It may be tied up with recruitment patterns, but what we do see is a period with a bit of decline. If we add some other height series, what do we find? The green line is convict men transported to Australia. That's a slightly later series of stature for prisoners in London. And that's an agricultural series. That's prisoners in local jails in Bedfordshire. And the thing they do have in common is a period of falling stature. So the 1810s, the 1820s, the 1830s do not look good for people's nutritional welfare. But the longer period isn't terrific. Those decades are the worst, but the rest are also not looking great. And it's interesting to map that on to what Bob Allen has taught us about rising inequality in the period. So that imposes one of Bob's charts onto the same time period. The blue line is rising output per worker, and the pink line is the historical real wage. And what we see in the pink line is Engels' pause. It flattens, it stays stagnant, while output is actually increasing. So what that's telling us is that people are working harder, but not being remunerated for it. Perfect conditions in which stature should fall. So you're putting in the extra effort, but you're not getting the resources to support that. We also see it from Engels' Pause article in the share of GDP, and the black line is labour, and you can see how, particularly in this period, the share of GDP for labour is declining, and it doesn't pick up again until the very end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century. So the story that we're getting then of long-run growth looks a bit like this. That's our military series. And Tim Hatton and Bray have given us a 20th century series. Now that's not military, so we'll do a bit of adjustment for truncation. Rosenbaum says you knock off an inch off military heights to get the real population height. I didn't knock off a whole inch because these are 18-year-olds compared with 20-year-olds. But you can see a long-run pattern in stature. You can see a period of improvement that is then met by getting on for a century of decline. And there are delays before things start improving. We get a bit of improvement. It's difficult splicing the series, but we start to see a bit of improvement after 1870 when imports of food are starting to come in. But real gains happening around the 1880s, 90s, into the 20th century. We gain 1.67 inches between 1886 and the start of the 20th century. And it's a story about improving nutrition at that point. Also, compulsory education comes in 1870, becomes more effective over time. It gets kids out of the workforce. So in the growing years, quite important growing years, they're no longer labouring in the same way they were. The retrenchment of children from the workforce helps support rises in the male breadwinning wage. And we also have some improvements in health. So there are important developments going on there. It also coincides with that improvement in labour's share, which is in part this wage story. And the 20th century story, of course, is a fascinating one. And we know from Hatton and Bray the importance of rising incomes, of improving nutrition, of declining infant mortality, reduced family size, better housing quality, improvements in health and sanitation, and I want to add to that list changes in maternal health and intergenerational transmission of poverty and its converse. You can see in there the impact that the war had. Earlier, you can see the impact of depression. You can see what happened when Thatcher came to power. The other big part then of this story is we see what the 19th century could have been if nutrition had been acceptable levels, at adequate levels, at the good levels that they were in the 18th century. If you can have growth of about 5 inches in that century, you could have had it potentially. Physically, it would have been possible to do it a century earlier. But there are bottlenecks, these big bottlenecks to do with income, to do with work, most of all probably to do with nutrition and to do with disease. So this is the story we get from height. Some anthropometricians have tried to push the discipline in new directions using skeletons, and Rick Steckel and others have given us the backbone of history. My colleagues and I, however, are interested in putting flesh on those bones. We're interested in a different set of weighty matters. So height's a great measure to tell you about childhood and growing up. But weight, which is a cumulative measure, is a current measure of net nutrition that varies over the lifetime. Now that can tell us about adulthood and ageing. It can tell us about the adequacy of diet over your lifetime. It helps if we now think about the energy costs that are required, the available calories that are there. So how the body works in a nutshell. Basal metabolic rate refers to the minimal rate of energy expenditure compatible with life. So that's just surviving. That's being inactive, recumbent, relaxed, thermoneutral, which means that the ambient temperature is about 23 to 25 degrees, all very nice. So BMR is an absolute minimum. If you want to wake up in the morning and get out of bed, you need more than BMR. You need an increment, and it's usually judged to be 1.27 of BMR. That allows you to do things like chewing your food, swallowing it, digesting it, excreting it. So the very basics of life require more than BMR, 1.27 of BMR. Then we have physical activity ratios and physical activity levels that allow for the fact that we usually do more than simply get out of bed and eat breakfast. Somebody has to make the breakfast. That takes further calories. Every activity we do requires extra inputs of energy. And these are expressed as multiples of the basal metabolic rate. So these are a few examples of levels of physical activity ratio. If, for example, you're loading a 16-kilogram sack onto a truck, as many, many men did in the 19th century, that requires a basal metabolic rate 9.65 times that base level of 1. If you're kneading dough, it's 3.4 times basal metabolic rate. So your level of activity determines how quickly you're burning up your calories. But we have to weight that by how much time we spend doing different activities. So this is our physical activity level. We work out for the average day how much time is spent doing different tasks with a different PAR value. So you might spend 8 hours sleeping, so that's absolutely base level, just 1 BMR. And in this example, 2 hours working in the garden, the field, ploughing, hoeing, whatever, at a much higher rate, 5.7. So for your 24 hours, in this example, you end up with a physical activity level of 2.1. So 2.1 times your BMR is what's required for that level of activity. And I think one of the big areas for future research is working out what are reasonable PAL levels for the 19th century. For many industries that are very slow to adopt technology that still rest on a lot of human energy, so building railways and all the other tasks. So we will be treating a PAL of 2.1 as heavy work, and I think we're being very modest in picking that level. Now we need some real data. We need some heights and weights of real people from the 19th century, and we have some. These are from houses of correction, so they're incarcerating misdemeanants on short-term sentences. So people who get drunk and disorderly on a Saturday night, people committing small-scale thefts, those sort of activities. And they're in prison for sometimes a matter of days, usually a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, up to 6 months. And we've got quite decent data sets. We've got 14,000 from Paisley, which is just outside of Glasgow, and we've got 32,000 from Wandsworth, just outside of London. Now, this is looking at 25 to 34-year-olds, and we can see that Wandsworth, the English men in Wandsworth House of Correction, were 165.3 centimetres in tall on average, and their weight was 62.7 kilograms. The Scottish men, the Paisley men, are a bit taller and a bit heavier. They both have the same BMI, body mass index, but the Scottish are a bit more robust. The basal metabolic rate for English men in Wandsworth is 1,547 calories a day. A little bit higher for the bigger Scottish men, which means that survival, getting up in the morning, means a minimum of 1,965 calories for the Englishman. If he engages in light labours during the day, so a PAL of 1.55, he's going to need around about 2,400 calories a day. If he engages in what we've called heavy labour, of a PAL of 2.1, he's going to need 3,250 calories. A little bit more for the bigger Scottish man. We can do the same exercise for women, and I've followed the FAO They use heavy labour for women as 1.82. Their models are based on women doing between 1 hour and 7 hours labour. And you can see the figures required then to support a woman. We can use this to get at what families needed. So a small young family in Wandsworth. We've got the husband's basal metabolic needs, the wife, and the 2 children, one in the 1 to 3 age category and one in the 4 to 6 age category, gives us a family total of 4,469 calories to wake up in the morning. If they want to get out of bed, they need about 5,675 calories. In none of these models do children ever do anything more than survival. So we have them not using additional calories, which you can imagine isn't all that credible, but it biases our results in the right direction. But if the mum and the dad are engaged in light levels of labour, the family now needs 6,500 calories. If the husband alone is engaged in heavy labour, the family needs go up to 7,336. The Scottish families even higher. Does it matter? How does it relate to Bob Allen's baskets? Well, he correctly labelled a basic sustainability basket as bare bones. So the basket that his welfare ratio buys provides 5,814 kilocalories. That means it provides survival. Doesn't allow anything for work. And it doesn't actually provide adequate survival if you're a bit bigger. And let's face it, criminals are going to be on the small side for the distribution because of the link with class. So it's not even sufficient for survival for the Scots. And that's before you start doing any work. Once you start doing work, even the respectability basket, which delivers 7,500 calories a day, falls short of supporting these Scottish men in doing hard labour. Let's look at it graphically. This is from Bob's lovely series of labourers, where we get the welfare ratio over time, and we can convert that to calories, which is what we've done on this axis. And that's what wages would have bought in London over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. So survival comes in there, and as we've seen, it's pretty well what it says. It's going to provide just about sufficient to keep alive. If you're doing light work, the husband and the wife, not the kids, you're starting to get a few difficult years. If the husband's actually doing the job that these labourers are doing, but doing it for the 250 days a year that this is based on, you've now got a lot of years. Those white gaps are years when there are not sufficient calories coming in to maintain the family. If they're a bit bigger, if they're Paisley-sized, you can see the problem is getting larger. If the man was doing heavier work, we're getting more and more deficits. If the family had more than 2 young kids, if you add another child, you've suddenly got a very long period of these 2 centuries when the breadwinner is not able to provide anything like sufficient calories for basic maintenance of this family. And all of this is still assuming that children are only at survival level, that the wife is only doing light labours, and that we're all thermoneutral. And those of you who've lived through this recent weather will know that that's an unlikely contingency. Now, there are alternatives for these individual families. One is that the man is doing work for more than 250 days a year. The other is that you supply more workers to the labour market. Both of these, of course, are going to bring in more calories, but they're also going to use up more calories. And there's also self-provisioning, and there's been some very interesting work done at the moment on self-provisioning. I think that's got to be a bigger part of this story. But we have an example of a real family from 1842 who lived 10 minutes away from here at Appleton Roebuck. And they are, as it happens, the Allen family. Joseph is an agricultural worker, and Joseph works, I wrote this down, he works 310 days in 1842. His wife Jane works for 214 days, and William, the 10-year-old boy, works for 223.5 days over the year. They keep a very careful budget. But there are 5 kids in this family. So even though they've managed to get up to 10,847 calories and they document everything that they're buying over this year, even though they've got up to that level of consumption, they've got to spread it around a much larger family. This means that per consuming unit, they've only got 2,107 calories. That is very, very low when you really need about 3,000. They are either self-provisioning, which I think is highly likely, or they're bearing costs in other ways. So what happens if calories are insufficient? Well, we're told you can reduce your work capacity, but you have to work if you're going to live. So there are other options, and one is unequal distribution within the household, to protect a breadwinner, probably. And there are costs to height and health. So let's have a look directly at consumption within some families. So we're looking at body mass, we're using our prisoners, we're assuming that they're coming from similar sorts of families. We've got age groups along the horizontal axis, and we've got body mass on the vertical axis. Body mass is kilograms per metre squared, so it's weight adjusted for height. It should be the same for men and women. We'll begin by looking at London. What happens to the Londoners? So London, service economy, it's got men operating in lots of transport jobs, labouring jobs, quite a wide range of different possibilities for the men. The women, on the other hand, are predominantly in domestic service, and there's a lot of child unemployment in London. So that's the sort of broad strokes. This is the body mass of men. And you can see, as you expect, it improves considerably as they're growing up. And they're reaching what looks, from our perspective, like a very healthy level of body mass. They're getting up to 23 kilograms per metre squared, and they're maintaining that for much of their life. It's dipping down, as wages do, over that lifetime. What about the women in these households? Well, sadly, their body mass does not match that of the males. They're doing okay as adolescents, but more or less from when they marry, body mass starts to shrink for these women. And we see when they go into prison on a diet of 1,600 calories, a bit over 1,600 calories, the older women put weight on. Younger women on a diet of 2,010 calories, half of them put weight on. So it tells us that that these women are underweight, they are likely hungry a lot of the time. What about a different type of economy? We've got Paisley. Paisley, the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution. We've got the thread industry. We've got lots of work in new industries for women and their children, for some men. But Paisley also is famous. You probably know about Paisley, the Paisley print, the Paisley shawl. This is a labour aristocracy, the handloom weaver. The accounts of the handloom weaver are inspiring. He is an admirable figure. But his industry is getting knocked out as the new industry is coming in. So we have the impoverishment of the handloom weavers. They go from a good handloom weaver earning 30 shillings a week at the end of the 18th century to earning 8 shillings a week by the middle of the 19th century. So it's an interesting economic and gender dynamic. How do the men do in these households? Well, not quite as well as London, but it's not a big gap. Probably the most notable feature is that their body mass does stay up a bit later on. What about the women? Are they going to do as badly as London women, or are these conditions more favourable? Yes, these are hefty women. They're getting a good amount of the calories going in these families. So we see a very different distribution of body mass, which is being underpinned by very different patterns, either in the home or in the workplace. What about the handloom weaver in Paisley? Well, he's looking a lot like women in London. So if you're marginalised, you're going to experience that in your very bodies. This has a corollary for how tall kids grow in these homes. The orange line again is London, and in Paisley, the boys and girls grow taller. This matters because there is a relationship between height and weight and morbidity and mortality. We know this from the big epidemiological study of Hans Wahler. It's based on Norwegian data. We're familiar with this. We're always being told about the dangers of being overweight. So there's a range of body mass for which risk is it's invariant, so the healthy range of body mass. If you're overweight, there are problems. But if you're underweight, there are problems. Susceptibility to infection is one of the greatest ones. The type of diseases that are susceptible to infection: measles, diarrhea, tuberculosis, respiratory infections, pertussis, intestinal parasites, cholera, leprosy, herpes. Then there's others that are less determinant. You're more likely to suffer from obstructive lung disease, from asthma and related conditions, from gastrointestinal disorders, which is going to inhibit stature, cardiovascular disease, neoplasms or growths, cancers. Women are going to have amenorrhea, which is a disrupted menstrual cycle, osteoporosis later in life, loss of muscle mass, bone mass, and their babies' birth weights and survivorship prospects are going to be compromised. These problems are felt very early in life. You feel these consequences with some immediacy compared with the ones we accumulate over time. So this is the sides of the bathtub. But these conditions are made worse. They're exacerbated by being short, which is why I want to try and get you to think of a three-dimensional image. So it's meant to be 3 dimensions. I don't quite have that technology yet. But what we have on this axis is weight, and that's getting heavier. On this axis, we've got height. So as we come forward in our 3 dimensions, we're getting taller. And the third axis is risk. In this case, we're looking at male mortality for a middle-aged group. It's based on Wahler's data, so it's modern Norwegian data. A risk level of 1, which is highlighted there, is the population average. So if you're there, you are underweight and short. I can't reach that. And if you're up there, you've got a risk level of about 90% higher than the average Norwegian today. You can also be short and overweight, and you're also going to be at much elevated risk of death in the next 10 to 20 years. So the thing to do is reach your optimal. Your optimal is there. And that healthy optimal, if you're short, implies a much higher body mass than the ranges that we're familiar with thinking about today. If you're there, you can reduce your risk level down to about 25% of the modern standard. But of course, the really ideal thing to do is to grow taller and heavier. And that's what really brings mortality risk down. And it brings it down to the below average levels. And of course, it's exactly what we've been doing for the last century. We've been growing taller and heavier, and we've doubled our life expectancies. It's not the only factor, but it's a factor. So where do our historical men and women fit in this story? That's where the Wandsworth men are, with a risk level about 18% above the Norwegian average. The Paisley men have managed to reduce their risk level so that they're only about 2% above the modern average. You still don't want to have a 2% higher risk, but it's a lot better than in Wandsworth. And they've done that by growing taller as kids and being a bit heavier. Both groups would have benefited considerably by putting on another 10 kilograms. They'd have further reduced their risk factor. For the women, and you'll see the curves of the Wala surface are steeper for women. The Wandsworth women are there. They're actually 30% above the modern level. So that gap that we saw in male and female body mass in London has implications for mortality risk. The work is yet to be done to see whether that translates, but 30% higher risk level. The Paisley women, those big hefty lasses that we saw in that chart, they've managed to come in on the modern average. They've reduced their risk level down to 1 by being taller and heavier. Again, had they been another 10 kilos heavier, they could have still reduced down a bit further. The Paisley women could have got 2 percentage points below the modern average, whereas the best the Wandsworth women could hope for, given their stature, was 8%. And the Wandsworth men could have got down to 11% instead of 18%, and the Paisley men could have got down to 1%. So the heights and weights are telling us something. The implication of these findings are that we'd see gender inequality reflected in regionally diverse patterns of differential mortality. So it's going to depend a lot on local labour market conditions. We saw how that shaped the distribution of calories, the total calories coming into the household and how they're divvied up. But I will get you to bear with me just a short bit longer, because it's important to think about why this connection exists. Why do we see a link between height and weight, morbidity and mortality? And an argument is that stunting is one outcome of a process that has seen the human organism degraded at an earlier point, degraded in ways with lifelong implications. And this is the Barker hypothesis, so the fetal origins hypothesis. So the conditions in utero, when you are conceived, your first 9 months, your welfare is very dependent on your mum's welfare. So your nutrition is a function of her nutrition, your oxygen, her oxygen. You get it through the placenta. If the mother experiences a nutritional insult, the infant is going to as well. It may be a protein deficiency, it could be a micronutrient shortage, trouble if it's folic acid, it could be a crisis in total calories. What they believe happens is that fetal undernutrition sets off a change in the hormones and the endocrine status of the developing fetus that can change the way the body develops and responds permanently. This is an epigenetic effect. We change the genetic expression because of the environmental conditions. So, for example, if you're undernourished, your body can learn to be very efficient at processing calories into energy and storing it as fat. You can think the implications that might have for obesity. So short-term survival gets bought at the cost of adaptations that can have longer-term ill consequences. And low-weight babies who've been followed through over many, many decades are seen to have high levels of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes and related illnesses, sarcopenia, a wasting, poverty of the flesh, degenerative disease, osteoporosis levels, the rate at which we age, and as I've said, later life obesity. So it's low weight at birth that translates into a problem later in life. So this is about being underweight, under height, unhealthy. And the timing matters. There are critical periods. So in that first trimester of a pregnancy, the neural tube is developing. So that's the brain, the spinal cord, the central nervous system. The digestive system's developing. Organs and bones are forming. The reproductive organs. So a woman's eggs that produce her children are conceived soon after her own conception, which links grandmother's health to her grandchildren's health. There's that lag there. If you get disrupted during that period, diabetes at any point in the pregnancy, undernutrition is likely to lead to later life diabetes. But there are more likelihood of coronary heart disease, blood and lipid problems, later life obesity, breast cancer, and problems like schizophrenia, antisocial disorder, levels of stress. In the second trimester, rapid growth, 21.5 centimetres on average put on in those 3 months. Lots of things are growing, but the bronchial tree in particular. So if you have a disruption at that point, not surprisingly, you see obstructive lung disease when those children are developing and grow up into adults. There's also problems with kidney disease and others. The third trimester, again, growing very, very rapidly, and the brain is growing very rapidly. This is the point where we put the effort into growing our big-brained babies. And if you have a disruption at that point, arguably you've got the mechanism that links with cognition. They know there's problems again with diabetes, with hypertension, with blood pressure, but there's also this question now of the link with cognition. Now, Jane Humphreys has pointed this information out. First trimester, you need an extra 85 calories a day when you're pregnant. 285 calories in the second trimester, 475 calories in the third. While you're breastfeeding, you need 675 calories every day. And if you start weaning at 6 months, it's going to drop down to 460 calories every day. So a baby is going to cost you 300,000 calories just via the mum. In that last phase, they're also being fed directly. And while those calories on this side are counted, as Jane pointed out and others, that they're counted in the allocations made for a child, the 0 to 1 year old allowance. These other calories during pregnancy are not. And it's not how it aggregates upon the big picture that I'm concerned about, but it's what those individual pregnancies, what happens in those. If women are struggling to find the extra 1,600 or the 2,000 calories that's going to keep them alive, where do you manage to find another 475 day after day after day for 3 months, and then top it off with finding 675 calories extra every day while you're breastfeeding. It's also, it doesn't fit easily with the maternal ethos of sacrifice at the time. So this is the mechanism that Osmani and Sen pointed to, that this process of reproduction transmits gender inequality, particularly dietary inequality, to both sexes. So the implication of this part of the story is that gender inequality is not seen in differentials in mortality among kids, but it's seen in their short stature, their reduced survivorship, their ill health, and their reduced longevity of both sexes. So yes, I've got to the end. Conclusions. The story we've had is a varied one. It starts off a happy story in which John Bull's larder was filling beautifully. And as it was in boom, we grew bigger and stronger, and we could work harder, and we became more productive and possibly more intelligent and definitely more numerous. And that was good fodder to get an industrial revolution on its way. But we go from boom to bust, and we lose 1,000 calories for every day for every equivalent male in the population. We've seen that breadwinners were often unable to meet the calorie needs of their families. We saw that when women filled the gap and children filled the gap, we saw some greater equality, even pro-female bias, that was linked with people growing taller. Their kids grew taller. But we also saw that when that gap wasn't filled, we saw terrible inequalities creeping in that was going to have health costs. So dietary deficiencies inflicted hunger, it cost height, health, possibly cognition, productivity, and it cost lives, particularly babies' lives. Did it sow the seeds of Victorian failure in the way that the earlier period was good for growth? Was this, like the squeezing out of education and other factors, part of the decline? It's a story that alerts us to who is made vulnerable through these processes of economic change, particularly the low-waged and the unemployed operating in unfettered markets. Even when they were skilled, if those skills start being marginalised. And the sequel to this story is a salvation that depended on international trade coming to the rescue, but also of trade union activity, of labour organisation, of lobbying for democracy and control of a state that became more interventionist. So height, I think I now think of height as something like a photographic snapshot, and you add weight and it's a bit more like a cine film, and it gives you a sense of change over people's lives. And height and weight track these major economic trends. They even help to shape them through human size and strength. Height and weight are very sensitive to distributional inequalities, so they capture differences for us of class and of gender. And they offer us a window into the lives of people that we often don't know about, and of their families, their health, their welfare, and their ageing. So it is a story carved out of families and flesh and blood and bone. This is them. Thank you.